Class. As always, these videos are for my class at Cleveland State University. If you're watching for some other reason, I presume you're under quarantine and have a lot of free time. Sorry, hope you recover soon. But back to my class. We're here to discuss The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, and we're very much interested in the novel, not in the television series or other film adaptations. Those are great. The novel is its own thing, and very much a work of art that makes choices that the adaptations stray away from. And I want to focus in on what Atwood has accomplished in the original novel itself. The Handmaid's Tale formally, in any formal description of science fiction, to the extent we can have one, and it's not clear we can, almost any definition would include The Handmaid's Tale. But The Handmaid's Tale has always been published outside the normal science fiction genre machinery. It's not from a science fiction house. It's not published. It's not always shelved with. It's not often shelved with the science fiction. Occasionally it is. It has always been treated as a literary novel, straight up, even though it uses the format of the dystopia, um, a a negative utopia, a kind of nightmare vision of a possible future used as a commentary on real trends in real politics. Both the utopia and the dystopia tend to be excluded from science fiction genre norms or publishing norms, or rather, these both seem to be very available to writers outside the genre walls. To the degree that utopia is sometimes used as a more positive term than science fiction, as having being less stigmatized, so sometimes it's considered higher status to call a work like The Left Hand of Darkness a utopia, because that sounds classier than science fiction, although utopias tend to be limited in certain ways that novels like The Left Hand of Darkness might not be. Playing the name game, Atwood herself prefers the term speculative fiction, which is loosely means science fiction not for dummies or literary fiction that uses science fiction tropes. We can play the name game forever, it doesn't get us very far. And before you invest too heavily in the speculative fiction idea, you should know that that term is originally coined by people who are unmistakably genre authors. So that idea comes out of the heart of action, adventure, rock'em sock'em, masculinist science fiction. So using it as an alternative to that is problematic. This novel works in a lot of ways, and I want to talk about its form. It works through, I also want to talk about, first of all, if you have skipped the final section, the historical notes on The Handmaid's Tale, you have not finished this novel. That last chapter is part of the novel, is an essential part of the novel, which changes everything that comes before, and which is the kind of most daring formal element of it. That chapter appears in none of the adaptations, which makes all the adaptations very different, inevitably. The ending, which will get its own video, is a very real and very important part of this book. And it makes this novel circular in an important, at least if not in a narrative, at least in an ideological way. We get back to where we began. Again, it'll have its own video. The Handmaid's Tale is marked by Atwood's prose, which is extremely clear, controlled, restrained, deliberately plain. In one way, a feminine style in that women are forced to hold their tongue, etc., but also a kind of Hebrew biblical style, or a style associated with English translations of the Hebrew Bible, what the Christians call the Old Testament, but which the authors of the Bible didn't consider the Old Testament, but just the Testament, Torah. The title is biblical with a hint of Chaucer, as Dr. Piasotto says in the final chapter. The language is controlled, restrained. It is everywhere about implication, about subtext. This is a narrator who cannot say everything she feels. This is a narrator who cannot fully remember our historical moment, and where we are forced to listen very, very carefully between the lines. For example, the running trope that of Fred, who has no other name in the novel, Fred, is looking throughout for a suicide weapon. She is consistently She is consistently, as repeated structuring trope, considering suicide methods as her primary method of escape, to the degree that the novel actually works formally to lead us on the first reading to expect that suicide. She's looking for that. I would like a knife like that, is a resonant sentence which carries a lot of implication with it. And in the end, she exits by other means, but you don't know that going in. The fact that there's a third option here, a kind of escape that's not an escape not driven by Offred, and that's not suicide, has not seemed to be one of the possibilities. So there's a kind of trick at the end before the even bigger formal trick. There is a dense, there's a really commitment to the reality of a physical location. This takes place in a future dystopia with events that never happened, but it's built upon the kind of underlying web of an actual physical set of locations where Atwood herself did part of her schooling. The novel is set in and around Harvard University in a dystopian world after a kind of reactionary counter-revolution in which that is no longer Harvard University. It is worth noting that we never learn the narrator's name. She has no name in this text other than Offred. She tells Nick her name, but she doesn't tell us. That is consigned to historical amnesia. The other word that never gets said is Harvard, though the place is very clearly Harvard Yard and Harvard Square and the area around Harvard, to the extent that there are segments that you can map on Google Maps. I will do a video just retracing those steps and talking about the locations. The name Harvard has also been consigned to historical memory. It is very subtly hinted that Offred might be an alumna of Harvard University or Radcliffe College, which was the women's component of Harvard University, and at the time the novel was published in the 80s, had been almost entirely integrated into Harvard College. There were no longer separate dorms for women. There were no longer separate application processes, etc. We're gonna do it's the imaginary garden with real toads. It's very literal and close. There are errors or slight adjustments of fantasy, but at moments Atwood is being very painstakingly realistic. That is the same place. She has chosen to imagine a dystopia that is, in effect, a restoration of 17th century American colonial Puritanism. Essentially, the dystopian people here are the original Boston Puritans back in full force. They fight the same sectarian battles. They also hate the Catholics, the Baptists, the Quakers, etc., as the Massachusetts Bay Puritans did. They have many of the same obsessions. They're in the same place, in the same central capital. That is historically off in some ways, in that, like, historically, that sect of Christianity has morphed and joined many of the more liberal American offshoots of Christianity, while newer Protestant groups have been have taken their place as the fire and brimstone groups. But there's a sense here of a kind of simple historical return. We are back to the place we began. I would point you to the dedication of this novel, which is dedicated to two figures, to Mary Webster and to Perry Miller. Mary Webster is a Massachusetts Puritan from the 17th century, whom apparently Atwood considers may have been her own personal ancestor. In any case, whether the rights or wrongs of that, Atwood thinks it, and Mary Webster was accused of witchcraft, acquitted, but then lynched by witchcraft believers. So a symbol, this is actually a few years before the dreaded Salem witch trials. So that we have a figure here, a persecuted Puritan woman under that regime. The other dedicatee is Perry Miller, the late Harvard professor, who in the 20th century put the American Puritans back on the map. He is the founder of kind of American studies, and one of the founders of American studies, but also of Puritan American studies. So someone under whom Atwood herself studied at Harvard. It's like, if you're gonna study the Massachusetts Bay Puritans anywhere, it should be Harvard, really. Another thing that makes this novel its own thing is there's a deep commitment to a limited point of view. There's a whole lot about this world that Offred does not know. She has a limited viewpoint. We hear rumors that she hears. We get scraps of information from her. There's a lot that she doesn't know, and so we don't know it either. We do not get to enjoy the conqueror's view of this place or hear much of their rationale. This is a novel about a voiceless character who is not allowed to speak, whose ability to read and write has been proscribed, has been taken from her, even though she might be a Radcliffe graduate, and who is not really in on that information, and in her, and who actually doesn't get a lot out of the commander when she's asked to spy on him. But that's her perspective. We're going to value the person who is not. We are valuing the person who will not be valued by the historical narrative, the person who does not have the backstairs person who is erased from history, who is left out, who is not allowed to talk, who is left out of the story, who literally has her children taken away from her, both her actual and her prospective children, given to other women for other women to claim as their own daughters. Everything has been taken from her, including her name, the name of her university, her place. And we stick to that limited viewpoint. We stick to it very hard, to the extent that we don't know at her, in the last moment of her narrative, whether she is being saved or not. And the retroactive chapter at the end actually suggests that she got a certain distance, but leaves silent whether she got all the way out. We know that we're told that Offred presumably got somewhere along the line in the female Underground Railroad, but we're not told whether she got all the way out or not. We don't know anything else that happens. What happened to her husband? We don't know. What else is going to go on with her daughter? We don't know. There's a choice here to value this person who's just an every woman, who is not near she's not near the corners of power. We are not going to have a kind of eagle-eye view from the throne room of this place. And the person who is most powerful in this novel, the commander, who has the most access to information and the most perspective on what's going on, is in some ways not very interesting. We find him, or is not someone we're asked to invest in much. He's only a problem, and we get all of his limits and all of his flaws. As well we should. So there's a commitment to the powerlessness here, including, like, it isn't one thing that might not happen inside commercial science fiction publishing is for the protagonist to be this passive. This would not be a young adult, and I know adaptations do different things. Offred is not really fighting the power that much. She is not a rebel. She is not particularly brave. She is not particularly active. This is the story of a victim who mostly has to go with the flow and do what's available to her to survive, who is often complicit. It's interesting to contrast the complicity here with some of the complicity of Dana in Butler's Kindred, where there aren't a lot of other choices, where there is no compensatory fantasy of power. That in fact, this novel forces us to face the fact that good, intelligent, even gifted people are forced into a position of powerlessness and don't get to change that, who are stuck in this history and only have a very limited way out. I think if you ran this text by certain editors today inside the commercial science fiction genre, they would insist that your protagonists have a goal, try to achieve it, face obstacles, and win. Offred isn't a winner. Offred isn't particularly a striver. But there have been millions of silent people like her, and this novel sets out to give testimony for those voiceless victims. The closure gives us a male voice expressing his lack of interest in what Offred has to say and being more interested in the winners, being more interested in the commander and the power. All right. That leads us to extra videos.